Welcome back. I'm Rich Goldstein, and I want to continue talking about IP. In particular, now I want to talk about trademarks and how that could affect your Amazon selling journey and how trademarks are important to your Amazon selling journey. So let's talk about the fundamentals here. So what trademarks are for is to protect consumer expectations. Trademarks are all about making sure that consumers don't get confused when they see your competitor selling a product with a similar name, for example. And when they see that product with a similar name, they immediately think of your company and they think, oh, maybe it's an offshoot of your brand. And so they mistakenly buy your competitor's product instead of yours. And to avoid that, we have trademarks and we register our trademarks and we enforce our trademarks to help prevent that type of likelihood of confusion. Now, on Amazon, you probably know trademarks are useful in that you can get brand registry and can enforce your trademarks through brand registry. And the precursor or the prerequisite to getting brand registry is having a trademark registration. So let's talk about how you establish your brand and how you protect it with a registered trademark. So first of all, you want to make sure that you have a trademark that's potentially registrable. And a trademark that's potentially registrable is one that's distinctive. And in trademark law, distinctive really means that it's the type of thing that people will associate with your brand and your brand only. So like a term like red licorice, people don't think of that as a brand name. People don't think of that as identifying a particular company. While, let's say, Coca-Cola, when you see Coca-Cola, you say, oh, that's a particular company. So when I buy a soft drink that's labeled Coca-Cola, I know that it's coming from a specific company. And accordingly, if a competitor of theirs were to label their product Coca-Cola, then that would create consumer confusion because people would buy it expecting it to be the real thing. I guess a little pun intended. But the point is, when they do that, then that's going to create a whole lot of confusion, and that's exactly what trademark law is designed to prevent. So again, when you're picking your brand name, you want to pick something that's distinctive. So you don't want to pick something that's descriptive. You want to pick something that seems like a brand name, something that's maybe a bit out of the ordinary for what you would expect in a term describing that type of product. So if you're selling pet food on Amazon, you don't want to sell it under a brand like Pet Food Store because that's not going to be distinctive. That's not going to seem like it's a particular pet food store. It's just going to seem like it's any old pet food store. So when something is not distinctive like that, you can't protect it, and you want to avoid that. And now, granted, when you're selling on Amazon, a lot of times you're cognizant of the fact that people are searching for things like pet food. And so sometimes a good compromise is to take a distinctive term and add it to those keywords. So something like cornucopia pet food store, right? So cornucopia is not something you would expect to be associated with pet food in particular. But if you put those together, you have the grounds of something that's a protectable brand, cornucopia pet food store, and you also have those keywords in your brand name. So that's an effective technique or a good compromise between having the type of terms that people might be searching for, while at the same time having something that's potentially going to allow you to get your trademark registered with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Now let's talk about what it takes to get your trademark registered. So you need to apply with a trademark application. And there are two bases by which you could apply. One is where you're actually using the name. So you actually are selling products under a certain, in a certain category. And then we apply with what's known as an actual use application. And we supply examples, which are known as specimens, that show how we're selling the product. We show labels, for example. A label is a good specimen we could provide. A label from the actual product that you're actually selling. We specify the first date in which you've been selling products in this way under that name, and we submit the trademark application. The trademark application will be reviewed by an examiner. If it's approved, then it will be published for opposition, meaning they publish it and give other people out there in the world 30 days during which they could object to the trademark if they feel that the examiner is incorrect and it's actually confusingly similar to their mark. They could oppose your registration, and that doesn't happen very often. So then once that period passes, that 30-day period passes, then the mark will continue on to be registered. They will grant you the registration. They'll issue you a registration certificate, kind of like, like this one. And essentially, then once that happens, you have a registered trademark, and you could enforce that against other people who might have a confusingly similar mark to yours. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is what's called intent to use. And that's when you haven't yet started selling the product, but you intend to do so in the near future. And so you could file an intent to use application without having that proof of use. And it gets reviewed by the trademark office examiner. And once it's granted, then the trademark office examiner will issue what's known as a notice of allowance. And once you get the notice of allowance, then you have 6 months to supply proof that you're actually using the mark, to supply those specimens. And then they'll complete the registration process. Or within that 6 months, you could also put in for a 6-month extension. And then you could do that a number of other times. In total, you can gain 2.5 years of time during which to supply that proof that you're actually using the mark in commerce, and to have the mark then fully registered and to get that trademark registration. So those are the two ways you can go: actual use or intent to use. One thing to keep in mind here is that you don't register a name in a vacuum. You don't just register a name for any purposes or any type of product. Trademarks are specific to a certain type of product or service. So if you're selling pet food, then that's going to be in one category. If you're selling pet food bowls, that's going to be in a different category. At the trademark office, those are called classifications. And so you might be filing a 1-class application for just pet food, or you might be filing a 2-class application for pet food and pet food bowls. So, but what that doesn't do is prevent someone from using that same name to sell, for example, auto parts. That's not likely to be confusing. Someone else could potentially use the same name as your product to sell auto parts if you're selling pet food, and consumers wouldn't tend to be confused between those two. So it's often possible to have the same name as another brand if you're in very different fields, such that consumers wouldn't tend to be confused between the two. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is that you need to be clear about the type of product or service that you're going to be offering. And so if you're planning to launch in a bunch of different categories, maybe you've got a product name or a brand name that you want to use for a few different categories, you want to be careful about the timing of it. Because if you put in, let's say, a 3-class application for the 3 different categories you're thinking of doing, but one of them is really your short-term goal, where the other 2 are longer-term goals, assuming your application gets approved, you're going to be ready to supply proof, for example, that you're selling pet food very quickly, and then you can get that mark registration completed. But if the other categories you're not really ready to launch yet, then not launching those products is going to hold up your registration for your first class or your first category. So you're going to want to keep those separate, or maybe do those in separate applications. So you want to be clear on what's short-term versus long-term plans when you're filing an intent to use application, so that, again, you don't hold up getting the trademark registration completed for the one in which you are going to be doing first. Okay, and so in general, like that's how you apply for the trademark. A few things that you want to keep in mind here is you can protect all different types of branding with the trademark. You can protect the name of the product. That's called a word mark. You can protect the logo by which you're presenting the product, and that's called a logo mark or design mark. You could also protect slogans that you use to sell the product. So like those things can be trademark registrations, but what you want to do is prioritize what's most important. And what's most important initially is the trademark registration for the word mark. That's going to be the one that's important for brand registry. And typically that's the one that's going to be most important for enforcement. You want to prevent people from copying the name of your product or having a confusingly similar name to your product. And that's where the word mark will come into play. And also just in terms of budget, like if you're starting out, you want to conserve resources. You want to apply for the most important thing first. And the most important thing typically is the word mark. And because that's where people might tend to confuse customers with competitive listings by having them think like, oh, the last time they bought a product with your product name, it's the same product, and by them using a confusingly similar name. So anyway, word mark is the primary approach that you want to take. It's going to lead you toward brand registry. And in the next module, Kevin King is going to talk about brand registry and the benefits of that, and that the role of that in your path as an Amazon seller. Now, I want to talk about renewing and maintaining your patents and trademarks. And if you're an advanced seller, chances are that you have some patents or trademarks, and it's important to keep track of when they need to be maintained and when they need to be renewed. And first of all, to be clear, patents don't get renewed. Patents generally cannot be renewed. Patents have a natural term, and after that term expires, then the invention becomes dedicated to the public domain. So it's not possible to renew a patent beyond its natural life or its term. In the case of utility patents, that term is 20 years from when you file. And in the case of design patents, that term is 15 years from when the patent issues. When it comes to trademarks, though, trademarks can be renewed. And there's just different principles at play there. And one of which is that if you've established a brand, part of the reason why trademark protection is provided is to protect consumer expectations about that brand name. So if you go to the store to buy Coca-Cola, you as a consumer would expect that that is coming from one particular company, from the Coca-Cola bottling company. And if, let's say, that trademark could not be renewed, and then suddenly lots of different companies could sell products called Coca-Cola, that would cause a lot of confusion among consumers. And avoiding consumer confusion is exactly what trademark law is all about. So the point is that patents will expire, and when they expire, they cannot be renewed. But trademarks can be renewed continuously or continually. And the point is to know the deadlines for doing so. But now talking about patents first for a moment. So the patents cannot be renewed, but utility patents do need to be maintained. So what that is that the utility patent will have a natural term of 20 years from filings when it expires. But if certain maintenance fees are not paid, then the patent will expire early, or will expire prematurely. And in particular, the milestones for that are 3.5 years, 7.5 years, and 11.5 years from patent issuance. That's when the maintenance fees need to be paid. And what you want to do is you want to keep track of those dates. Once you know when your utility patent issues, you'll want to put in some type of calendaring system, some type of reminder system, those milestones, so that you make sure that you pay the maintenance fees at 3.5, 7.5, and 11.5 years after the patent issuance. And by the way, you could look up the maintenance fee status of your patent or any other patent out there by going to the USPTO maintenance fee storefront. And all you need to do is just Google USPTO maintenance fees, and it'll bring you to a page where by putting in the serial number and the patent number, you can get the maintenance fee status. And the way that it works is that once the window opens for paying the fee, so for example, the 3.5 year fee, the window opens at 3 years. So beginning at 3 years from patent issuance, you can pay the fee, and then you'll need to pay it by 3.5 years after. And at the maintenance fee storefront, you can see what those fees are, and you could actually pay the fees as well. And by the way, with regard to those utility patent maintenance fees, if you miss the 3.5-year mark, there's a 6-month grace period during which you can still pay the fee, and then you just need to pay a surcharge. But you don't want to go past that. So if you go past the 4-year mark, then the patent will be abandoned, and then it's a whole nother problem. Sometimes abandoned patents can be revived by paying a pretty hefty fee. Sometimes they cannot. So keep track of those dates for your utility patents. When it comes to a design patent, it's real simple. A design patent does not require maintenance fees. So the design patent will last for the full 15-year term after the patent issuance without payment of any fees. So there's nothing you need to keep track of there. Okay, now let's talk about the trademark side. So now over on the trademark side, if you have some registered trademarks, they need to be renewed at certain points. Otherwise, they will expire. And most of the time, once they do expire, they cannot be revived. You essentially need to start over again if it's even possible. So here's the milestones to keep in mind. First one is at 5 years after the trademark is registered. So at 5 years after the trademark is registered and before 6 years after the trademark is registered, so between the 5th and 6th year, you want to file what's known as a Section 8 Declaration of Use. And the Section 8 Declaration of Use is critical to keep the to keep the trademark in force beyond the 6-year mark. So you need to supply specimens that show that you're continuing to use the mark in commerce. Like a specimen is an example that shows how the mark is being used, and it has to meet the criteria of the trademark office to be a proper specimen. But you supply specimens, you pay a fee, and then the registration of the mark will continue. But there is something else that you can and you often should do at that point, which is to file what's called a Section 15 affidavit. It's known as a Declaration of Incontestability. What's incontestability? Basically, once you get incontestable status, then it significantly narrows the grounds by which someone else can attack your trademark and try to take that registration away from you. It's known as cancellation. Like there are ways in which other people can move to cancel your mark and essentially get it revoked. But once you get that incontestable status, then it really reduces the ways in which that can be done. So at that point, again, between 5 and 6 years after registration, you should seek incontestability of the mark. And often this is done at the same time. You file a Section 8 and a Section 15 affidavit. In fact, you file them together. It's called a Section 8 and 15 affidavit. And that Section 15 affidavit, you're basically declaring that the mark has been in continuous use in commerce for 5 years. And when you file these marks together and you pay fees to file these declarations together, I should say, then you will renew the trademark and also get incontestable status, most likely granted for it. Okay, so that's one milestone. So again, the first milestone for your trademarks and trademark renewal is between 5th and 6th year. And then after that is at the 10-year mark. So basically before the 10th year, after trademark registration, or another way to say it is between the 9th and the 10th year, you then file for a renewal. And again, you supply a statement showing that the mark is in use. You supply specimens showing that the mark is continually being used. And a specimen basically is proof that this mark is being used to sell the product or service that your mark is registered for. So at that 10-year mark, or at that 10-year point, you file that affidavit, and then you get to renew the mark for another 10 years. So then at that point, then at the next 10-year period, or let's say 20 years after the mark was registered, that's when you do your next renewal. So then at that point, it becomes every 10 years. So to summarize, it's between the 5th and 6th year, you file typically the Section 8 and 15 affidavits. And then between the 9th and 10th year, you file for renewal. And then again, between the 19th and 20th year for renewal. And then between the 29th and 30th year, you file for renewal. And that's what you need to do to renew your trademarks. And so you want to keep close watch on those dates, make sure that they don't pass, because your trademarks are a valuable part of your intellectual property portfolio and can be extremely valuable to your business. You don't want to let it lapse. And I hope this was helpful. And again, if you need any further assistance with anything related to the IP matters of patents and trademarks, feel free to contact that firm. Thank you.